Hello, Theater Production Lab. We're going to continue today with those pieces that I gave you. And so, but before we get started, I need to tell you some things about the sewing machine first. Now, a sewing machine works with two threads, an upper and a lower. The upper thread comes off of the thread of spool, the spool of thread that you buy from the store. The lower thread is wound onto what we call a bobbin inside a bobbin case in the machine. Okay, and I've threaded the machine for you. It's set for you, so you don't have to do any of that now. But we're going to learn a few more parts of the machine. Now I'm going to make this come closer. You see in the back there is a little handle right there that controls the presser foot down here. So watch what happens when I take this lever down. The presser foot kind of clamps down. If I bring it up, it allows me to pick up the presser foot so I can put fabric underneath there. So that's one thing you're going to have to use. And usually you reach it by going behind the throat of the machine and pulling it down. Okay, you have to have that down in order to sew. The other thing that you're going to have to learn about is the hand wheel. It's this thing over here. If you turn it towards yourself, that will make the machine sew. Now you'll see that it'll make the take-up lever work and the needle go up and down. So you need to know how to do that, because that'll anchor your fabric before you start sewing. The last thing I have to tell you about is this little dial here. This is a spring dial, or whatever you want to call it. And in order to do reverse on the sewing machine, you have to hold this lever up. And when you release it, it goes back to sewing normal. Now, when do we use that? We use that at the beginning and end of a stitch to lock the stitches in place. It's called back stitching. So I'm going to get a little closer to the machine and show you what we're going to do. But before we go there, I want to, you know your two pieces of fabric that you have. You have them stitched. One side has the fold or the hem, and the other side has the smooth side. We call the smooth side the right side, and we'll call the side with the fold on it the wrong side. And when you sew, you usually put right sides together. So I'm going to put both smooth sides against each other, line them up, and you're going to notice in my sample, one side is a little shorter. So just sew to the end of the shortest side. So I'm going to put them together like this. If you have trouble holding them, you can take a pin and pin them down. Now, to begin with, just be careful with sewing. It's best right now that you pull your pins out before you sew on them. There's certain ways you can sew to roll over the pins, but we're not going to go through that now. You're going to take and you're going to do a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Remember that? 5/8 inch, and that will create a stitching line all the way down here. And so you're going to back stitch, stitch all the way down, and back stitch. And I'm going to get closer to show you that and show you where the stitch line is at. Okay, on this silver plate here under the presser foot, you're going to see a bunch of strikes or lines. The very first long strike here is a 5/8 inch marking, so that I know that if I put the right edge of my fabric, and it's got on the other side too, if you're left-handed, but if I put the right edge there against that one line, and I keep it there as I'm sewing parallel to that, I will have a pretty decent 5/8 inch seam allowance when I'm done. Okay, so let's go through the steps. First, put your two pieces together, right sides together. Next, position them under the presser foot, following the 5/8 inch seam allowance guide on the machine, and then you're going to anchor the beginning of it. And I'm right there. I'm trying to get pretty close to the edge of the fabric. Okay, Then I'm going to hold my tails of my thread down a little bit because we don't want them to suck into the machine and jam the machine. But then I'm going to use my hand wheel on the side, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it towards myself and stick it down into the fabric just to anchor it in place and get the machine started. And so I've got my presser foot down, my fabric anchored, and then at this time I'm going to go ahead and give the machine some gas, as I call it. Puts the pedal. And I'm only going to go a few stitches. 1, 2, 3, stop. And then I'm going to use that spring lever. I'm lifting up the spring lever now, and it's going to go backwards to the edge of the fabric, and I stop. And now I'm going to go forward again. And then I'm going to pull my pin, and I'm going to stitch, 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 stitch. Okay, I slow down at the other pin, pull out, and then I'm going to get to the end of my short piece, and I'm going to do the spring lever again, the reverse. I'm going to lift it up. It's going to go backwards a few stitches, and I'm going to come forward. When I'm at the end, I'm going to use the hand wheel on the side, turn it towards myself to pick up the needle to the most up position. I know it's not correct English, but the highest position. And then I'm going to lift up the presser foot, and I'm going to pull on the threads. And then I can go ahead and trim those. Now I'm using a contrasting color so you can see, but you should be able to see where there's extra stitching on the ends. That means that the fabric was back stitched and it's going to lock in place. Okay, there's one more thing you have to do. Okay, now you're going to finish your sample by pressing and opening the seam. So to begin with, you're just going to take your sample and just lay it on the ironing board flat like you got it. And then you're going to season the stitches just by pressing right over it. I'm using this little mini iron for sake of showing. But you should have something that looks like this. It's got a little fin on it. But now we have to actually open that seam. And you want to get it as flat and smooth as possible. So you see I'm using my fingers to spread open the seam, and then you can begin to flatten it as you iron it out. So most garments are going to have the seam allowances opened, especially if you're sewing it yourself, because it makes a much neater finish. So when you look at the front side of your garment, it should be pretty smooth and flat. So you should have a nice little sample that looks like this with two hand stitches on the edge and machine stitch sample center and the seams pressed open. And that's it.